Hello and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bower, the editor of GP Online. Today on the podcast I'm joined by our deputy editor Nick Bostock and our senior news reporter Kimberley Hackett to talk about some of the key news stories affecting general practice. Coming up, we're talking about the GP jobs crisis after the BMA held a virtual rally last week to help the union shape its plans for how to address the job shortage facing salaried and locum GPs. We'll also be looking at the findings from our own survey of locum GPs that show the impact this is having on those doctors affected. And we'll be discussing GP premises following a report published last week by the NHS Confederation that suggested NHS Property Services, which owns a significant number of GP premises, should be scrapped. Our good news story this week is about practices in the northwest of England which have received extra funding to help them develop research hubs. That's all to come on this episode of Talking General Practice. So Nick, let's come to you first. We're talking about the GP jobs crisis, which we've talked about a lot on the podcast over the past year or so. But the reason we're talking about this is that the BMA held a virtual rally about the issue last week. What were they hoping to achieve with that?
We've been writing and talking for more than a year now about GP unemployment. The BMA and RCGP say thousands of GPs are struggling to find work or enough work. And we've written about some frightening examples of the impact this is having on individual GPs. A qualified GP working as an Uber driver because they couldn't find work as a GP. Others using food banks, taking on jobs outside of medicine or in private healthcare. And obviously GPs moving abroad to find work. Fundamentally, there's about two factors. An expansion of GP training in recent years, at the same time as GP practice finances have been squeezed hard by a combination of falling real terms funding and rising costs. And one of NHS England's top officials actually admitted last year that the health service had significantly increased the number of GP registrars coming through training, but hadn't increased funding enough to create the capacity for practices to employ them. So there are more qualified GPs coming into the jobs market, but practices simply haven't been able to afford to hire them. And it's not just GPs at the start of their careers, but many experienced GPs as well who are caught up in this situation. GPs have also blamed the Additional Roles Reimbursement Scheme, the ARRS, for pushing practices towards a model that involves fewer GPs and more staff in other healthcare roles. It's a scheme with £1.4 billion a year in ring-fenced funding to pay for staff in general practice, none of which can be used to hire GPs. Obviously, since October, there's been some additional money to recruit GPs through the ARRS as well. But as we've discussed on previous podcasts, the jobs don't seem to have proven all that attractive for reasons including low pay, concerns about their permanence and so on. But anyway, to come back to your question, the online event you mentioned was set up to bring GPs together to try and find out more about the problem, talk about potential solutions and some of the work currently going on as part of, for example, GP contract negotiations that, to try and tackle the problem. There were speakers from the BMA GP Sessional Committee, the BMA England GP Committee Chair also spoke. There are others from the RCGP and people speaking on behalf of LMCs who all gave sort of different perspectives and spoke about their experiences of the unemployment crisis. And part of the plan too was to encourage more GPs to complete a survey that will feed into BMA lobbying around the unemployment crisis.
You attended that meeting online, didn't you? What exactly happened? Did you get a sense about how GPs are feeling about all of this? What were people saying?
The person chairing the event was Dr. Mark Steggles, the BMA Sessional GP Committee. So sessionals cover salaried GPs and locums. He said it was absolutely astonishing that general practice has reached the stage it's at now where GPs who are in work are really struggling to cope with their workload, while at the same time, lots of GPs are struggling to find jobs. He said he didn't think any GP who had joined the profession in the past few decades could ever have foreseen a situation like this. And he called it ridiculous and bizarre. But ultimately, in terms of how GPs are feeling, I think the answer is that this is really frightening. Dr. Vicky Mackay, who is a co-chair of the BMA GP Registrars Committee, she spoke about registrars staring into the abyss, having come through medical school and years of training, nearing qualification as GPs, only to face this real uncertainty about whether they'll be able to find a job in general practice once they qualify, in the UK at least. And she spoke about the emotional toll that was taking. As I touched on before, this isn't just about newly qualified doctors, though. Dr. Steggles said the job crisis is now evident across the board, so GPs affected at all career stages. And in terms of solutions, Dr. Matt Mayer, who's the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire LMC chief executive, spoke about how important it is for GPs affected by this problem to lean on their LMC for support. Dr. Victoria Georgiou-Brown, who's vice chair at the RCGP, she talked about the need to overhaul workforce planning and invest in GP retention. And Dr. Amy Small gave some advice around using local networks to help GPs find work and the need to explore sort of other options, such as looking at jobs in urgent treatment centres or hubs delivering extended access appointments to find work for GPs. But really, the solution is funding. Practices need financial backing to recruit available GPs and money to develop premises to actually fit them in.
Yeah, I'm going to talk to Kimberley in a minute about the impact on GP registrars, because there's some stories she's written recently specifically about that. But just still sticking to this rally, one of the speakers you mentioned earlier was the BMA England GP Committee Chair, Dr. Katie Bramall-Stainer. And some of the things that she said not only gave an insight into the GP jobs crisis, but also how the GP contract negotiations are potentially going and how that all fits into this. What did she actually have to say?
So several speakers mentioned the fact that GP practices just can't afford to recruit more doctors. And as I said, that's really the root of the problem in terms of the unemployment crisis. As you mentioned, negotiations on the GP contract for 25-26, so that's the upcoming financial year, are ongoing, and they're expected actually to conclude this month. And Dr. Bramall-Stainer talked about how a key part of those talks, like a key aim for the BMA, is about pushing for investment to correct erosion across some of the main income streams for general practice. Number one is the global sum payments for general practice. That's the core funding per patient practices receive through the contract formula. As was the case this year, funding uplifts for general practice are often applied in the form of an uplift to global sum payments. But although those payments have risen, they still haven't kept up with inflation, so that's contributed to erosion of real terms funding overall. Global sum funding contributes actually only about half of the income practices receive, and when uplifts are applied to that alone, some of the other really significant income streams are often ignored completely. So Dr. Bramall-Stainer made the point that value of QOF points, which is funding practices receive for hitting various clinical targets, hasn't really risen for years. They've been uplifted largely to reflect population growth, but not inflation on top of that. And vaccination and immunisation tariffs have been frozen since about 2017. BMA says they're now worth about 21% less than they were 5 or 6 years ago. And the statutory reimbursements available to practices to cover parental leave, sickness leave or suspension leave have also been frozen. So the funding practices can claim through the contract deal to replace GPs in periods of absence has also sort of dropped a lot in real terms. So fixing all of that is a big priority, along with funding to cover the impact of the budget announcement last October. We've spoken before about increased costs for employer national insurance contributions and the rise in the minimum wage, potentially adding about £250 million to practice costs from April. Dr. Bramall-Stainer actually put that figure higher. She mentioned budget losses in the region of £300 million. So we know there's a pot of funding worth £889 million available to uplift the GP contract in 25-26. But as we discussed before, loads of that will be consumed by those costs linked to the budget, funding for ARRS jobs, a pay increase for staff in general practice, and so on. And even after this year's funding uplift, which was the biggest GPs had seen for quite a while, the BMA said general practice funding was still down by about £350 million compared with 2018 or 2019. So as I said, fixing all that is really important. Dr. Bramall-Stainer said that's the only way to give practices the headspace and the financial ability to start hiring available GPs. So these are some of the things the BMA will have been pushing for in the contract talks. But as well as wanting to correct this funding erosion right now, negotiators also have one eye on the future. For the past few years, contracts have been imposed on general practice because the BMA hasn't been able to reach an agreement with the government and NHS England. And this year, the BMA feels a negotiated deal is really important because of the timing. The government's currently working on a 3-year spending review that will set the financial framework for the coming years. And the BMA feels a deal on this year's GP contract is needed to open the door for general practice to be part of talks around how wider NHS funding plans take shape over the coming years. And as part of that, shaping the substantive new contract the BMA GP committee says it wants to see from 2028. So we'll have to wait and see over the coming weeks what comes out of the contract talks. Is there enough money available this year to make a dent in the unemployment crisis? How hard would the GP committee want to push the government this year, given that, that one eye it's got on the future? And then obviously next month, there's the special LMC's conference coming up where GPs are going to vote on potentially stepping up action. Will the government come up with a contract that offers enough hope to persuade GPs not to go that way? So basically, with all of this, it feels like a really pivotal moment for general practice.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I mean, I think you said on the last news podcast when we were talking a little bit about this, about the fact that obviously this is also the first contract that will have been negotiated with this new Labour government, and how important it is to try and ensure that there's something positive from this to build on for the future, and in the context of the 10-year plan, in the context of moving more care out of hospitals into the community, in the context of everything this Labour government wants to do. I imagine the BMA really wants to be able to get to a position where it feels like it's able to work with the government to secure the future of general practice, rather than being in a position where it's in conflict because they don't feel like they're getting enough to help protect the profession. So, yeah, I think it is a very crucial time, isn't it? It's going to be really interesting to see what comes out, and perhaps not just the contract itself, but what each side is saying about the deal, whether they think it's positive and how they think it's a good thing, and whether they try and sell it to GPs, and if they do, how they're trying to sell it. So, yes, all to come, hopefully, in the next few weeks. But Kimberley, let's bring you in here. I mentioned earlier that, and Nick's also talked about GP registrars and how they've been pretty hard hit by this jobs crisis. You wrote a story last week that really demonstrates the impact it's having on GPs coming through training. What have you found about how GP registrars at the moment feel about all of this?
So I had a chat with Dr. Vish Mehra, who is the chair of Manchester LMC, and he said that one of his trainees told him that they know of other GP registrars who are so worried about being unable to find work that they are looking at ways to extend their GP training just to stay employed. He explained that if registrars don't complete all of the requirements for workplace-based assessments, they can trigger an extension by about 6 months. Now, he was very clear that this is a recent move made by some registrars, but he feels that it is no longer uncommon. Only last year, we reported that some GP registrars were actually deliberately failing their exams to delay leaving training posts.
Yeah, we did write about that last year, didn't we? But it's kind of interesting that this is obviously a problem that's still going on, and it sounds like it might be something that more and more GP registrars are feeling they have to consider because they're worried about getting jobs. It's a really shocking state of affairs, really, isn't it? Oh, you also spoke to Dr. Cheska Ball, who's the co-chair of the BMA GP Registrars Committee recently, and we ran a few stories from that interview on GP Online. But what does she have to tell you about how the jobs crisis is affecting registrars?
So she told me that most GP registrars want salaried roles when they complete their training, but because there are so few jobs out there, with some GPs, as she puts it, being muscled out of the NHS, there is a feeling among registrars that they will have to accept additional roles reimbursement scheme or ARRS GP roles when they qualify, despite their reservation about the roles. Dr. Ball really wasn't keen on these roles. She told me that the low salary was a big issue, with some posts only advertising £900 more per year than she earned in her third year of training. The low salary for these roles is because the funding only covers a salary of £73,114 a year, which works out to just over £8,000 per session, well short of the standard rate of £10,500 or higher per session. Another issue is that an ARRS GP will be hired via the PCN, which means the GP will most likely be expected to work at multiple sites. Dr. Ball said that this setup so early on in a GP's career could make it difficult for them to build relationships with patients and other members of staff. She said that registrars are essentially stuck between a rock and a hard place after qualifying. They either take their ARRS GP roles or they end up working in A&E on lower grades or even going into private work. And this is why so many GP registrars are considering moving abroad when they qualify. We previously reported on BMA polling that found just 38.4% of GP registrars plan to work in the UK when they complete their training. And Dr. Ball said that countries like Australia and Canada really are hitting the nail on the head with their recruitment campaigns because they offer more money and a better work-life balance. So it's understandable why so many registrars consider leaving the country once they qualify. She also told me that one of the BMA GP Registrars Committee's biggest concerns is that international medical graduates, known as IMGs, could be at risk of exploitation through the low-paid ARRS roles because they may be willing to accept a poorly paid post because they often come with visa sponsorships, and therefore the IMG GP will be eligible to stay in the UK.
That is a real concern. Another big story that we've done over the past couple of weeks that links in with all of this, which is worth talking about now, relates to our annual GP locum rate survey and what that showed this year. So every year, in conjunction with our sister site GP Business, we survey GPs who undertake locum work and ask them questions about how much they earn for sessions and hours worked in GP practices, as well as how demand for their services has changed in the previous 12 months. We've been doing this survey for a really long time now, many years. So it provides a really good picture of how work opportunities and pay for locum GPs has changed over that time. It won't come as a surprise to anyone listening that this year's survey painted a pretty grim picture about the state of things for locum GPs. So there's two sides to this really: actual rates of pay that locum GPs are receiving and then the amount of work that's available. So let's look at the rates of pay first. The poll showed that average rates paid to locum GPs by practices had fallen in most parts of the UK over the past 12 months. So across England as a whole, the average daily rates charged by locum GPs had actually remained the same compared with the average daily rate we found last year. But average half-day rates and hourly rates had both fallen by 3%. So this was all compared to the figures we obtained when we carried the same survey out a year ago. When you look into different areas of England, only the south of England had seen a very slight increase in daily locum rates, but all parts of the country had seen a fall in hourly rates. We also look at those figures in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and that's where most of the people who respond to the poll tend to report daily rates. And we found actually that the average rates charged had fallen by 6% in Wales and by 3% in Scotland, but they actually rose by 3% in Northern Ireland. We also asked locum GPs who respond to the poll whether they've cut their rates or increased them, or if they've stayed the same over the previous 12 months. And in England, over a third, so 36%, said they had cut their rates during the past year, while in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, 19% said they'd cut their rates. And that 36% in England who said they cut their rates during the past year is the highest I can ever remember that locum GPs saying they'd done that. Last year, when we did the survey, 24% said they'd cut their rates.
Why is it that locums are cutting their rates? Is it because there's less work available?
I think that's the major reason. A lot of this has got to do with the rates that practices are offering, really. Maybe in previous years, locums have been able to really dictate how much they're paid, but a lot of it now is driven by what practices are offering work for. So lots of locum GPs responding to our poll said that they had to work for lower rates because that was the only work available. And if they weren't prepared to take a shift or a day for that lower rate, there was another locum GP who would come along and who would take it. So they wouldn't get the job. The person who was prepared to take the lower salary would. You know, some of that's to do with more competition for the jobs that are available. Potentially there are more locums out there. Maybe some of that is because some of those locum GPs couldn't get salaried GP posts. The survey also found in England that, it was a massive 91% said that employment opportunities for locum GPs in their area had fallen during the previous year. And the poll suggests that most locum GPs can't secure the amount of work they actually need, and that's what's led to a really big fall in income for lots of locum GPs. So 71% of locum GPs in England had struggled to find work in the previous year. Just as a comparison, that figure has risen a lot since last year. Last year it was 54% said they'd struggled to find work. And in this latest survey, 2/3 of locum GPs said they hadn't been able to secure the amount of work they wanted. And that's up from 45% last year. And 2/3 said that had had a significant impact on their income. Those figures are all about England, but there are also some signs that things are getting worse for locum GPs in other parts of the UK as well. Talked about rates of pay, but 74% of locum GPs in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland said that there were fewer job opportunities in their area than a year ago, and 43% of locum GPs in those countries said they'd struggled to find enough work, and that's significantly up on the 21% who said that last year. And I think this reflects some of the things that we're talking about earlier for England as well. You know, we know practices in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are also dealing with underfunding. And so it's obviously likely that practices in those countries are also cutting back on their use of locum GPs.
How are locum GPs who are sort of caught up in all of this affected? What impact is it having on them?
Well, it's pretty terrible, really. So I'm just going to talk about England, really, because that's what we looked at the most, where the problems are the most acute. And quite a few respondents there said they were facing significant financial difficulty. Lots of people saying they were struggling to pay their bills and their mortgage. A few people saying, you know, in turn that had a huge impact on their mental health and their personal relationships, including marriages. You know, people were volunteering this information to us. One GP said they were losing money every month. Another one said they hadn't worked for 5 months despite trying really hard to find work, and that's pretty shocking. Some GPs were worried they might struggle to revalidate if they weren't able to pick up more work. A lot of them said things like Kimberley talked about earlier. They knew of locum GPs who'd already left the country to work overseas or left the NHS to take on work in the private sector because they couldn't find work. And quite a few of the respondents were considering those options themselves because they were struggling to find jobs. So it's all pretty devastating. Another point that's important to mention is that people were also saying that when they did get jobs, they were often getting less hours than they previously would have done, with lower rates of pay, like I've already said. And they've often had to travel a lot further, sometimes even having to stay overnight to get work. All of that obviously also having an impact on how much their take-home pay is. The thing to think about here is that many people become locum GPs because they wanted the flexibility of being able to work hours that suit them. And clearly this situation means that for many of them, that flexibility is now gone. They're kind of having to take jobs as and when they can get them, regardless of whether it's convenient for them. And I think we shouldn't really overlook that, because some people listening to this might think it would be better if all of these locum GPs were in substantive posts. It would be better for everyone if they had permanent jobs in practices. But there are really many reasons why people decide to work as locums, and some GPs will spend their whole career in that role, but some will come in and out of that way of working, or maybe only do it for a short part of their career. Or they might work a few shifts to top up another part-time role they have. And, and locum work is a way to keep GPs in the workforce and build extra capacity. For example, GPs who have caring responsibilities or other personal issues may feel unable to commit to a permanent role in a practice, but can work as a locum. And if those locum posts aren't available, they are effectively GPs that are being lost to the NHS.
We ran another story this week around the issue of locum struggling to find work, which also sort of gives a sense of how this is just an absolute waste of potential GP capacity at a time when general practice is under massive pressure. The National Association of Sessional GPs, the NASGP, shared some data with us about unused locum sessions. It's based on 6 ICBs where they use a booking tool created by the NASGP. And across those 6 ICBs in the past 6 months, there were around 6,800 available locum sessions per month on average that were not booked. A session is basically half a day. If you estimate that GPs deliver around 15 appointments per session, it works out at more than 100,000 potential GP appointments a month that weren't used. Basically, if you extrapolate this across the country, it works out at about 11.5 million unused appointments, something like 1,800 for every GP practice in the country. Coming back to what you've been talking about, that means lots of locums who aren't earning the money they'd like to, and it means patients obviously not getting access to GPs who who are available if only practices could afford to hire them. Some of the things that Dr. Richard Fieldhouse, who's the chair of the National Association of Special GPs, he talked about someone he knew who's a locum who's based in Essex and was travelling to Gloucester for work. The other point he made was that the way that locum sessions are often booked tends to sort of contribute to this pressure downwards on the fees that locums can earn. People in sort of WhatsApp groups and looking out for message boards where the practice will post a job and the price they're willing to pay for it. So if the practice posts something that's really quite low, someone on that group is going to grab it because in the current situation, people are really desperate for work. Whereas the system that they are trying to promote is one where basically locums all display their availability and the price they work for, and then people who want to hire them come in and book on that system.
It's a really difficult time for locum GPs, really difficult at the minute, isn't it? I thought we should do a quick update on a story we discussed on the last news podcast 2 weeks ago about the targeted enhanced recruitment scheme, because we got some more information on that this week. So if you remember, this is the scheme that offers financial incentives for doctors to take up GP training posts in the most under-doctored parts of England. And on the last podcast, we were talking about the fact that it could be axed from this April. But Nick, we found out some more about that. What's the latest we know on this?
So NHS England confirmed in the end that this scheme will not continue beyond April. Sent out a letter to postgraduate deans this month that explained the decision not to keep it going, despite warnings from the likes of the RCGP about the impact that could have.
On the podcast a fortnight ago, I did ask you whether you thought it was going to be scrapped, and you did predict that it was pretty likely it would be. You had some good reasons for thinking NHS England would can it. Why do you think they have scrapped the scheme?
Obviously, I had a 50-50 sort of chance of getting that one right, so maybe I just got lucky. But some of the reasons we talked about on the last podcast were pretty much what the letter from NHS England said in the end. The letter said the decision had been taken because the NHS budget is really tight, tough decisions had to be made, and it pointed out that the fill rate for GP training is 100% at the moment, and that numbers of people taking up training posts is continuing to grow, as we've already talked about. The letter also made the argument that spending around £18 million on this scheme, which it was saying was the amount that would be spent in the year ahead, I guess, to offer golden hello payments to doctors, despite the fact that it's been effective at attracting registrars to areas with shortages of GPs, was just hard to justify when cuts are being made elsewhere. So TERS, the Targeted Enhanced Recruitment Scheme, is no more. The RCGP said the scheme had helped bring registrars to parts of the country they might not otherwise have considered, and that the funding it offered helped them to sort of put down roots, maybe helping them buy a flat or a house in an area that they moved to as part of this scheme. And that could mean they stay on in that area in the longer term. We know there are really big gaps between parts of England in terms of the number of patients that there are for each GP. So hopefully the end of this scheme won't contribute to widening those gaps further.
Just a quick message to say that MIMS Learning Live Digital is taking place online across 4 evenings from the 10th to the 13th of March. If you need some help keeping up to date with clinical practice, our colleagues from our sister site MIMS Learning can help with this series of evening webinars. You'll have the chance to earn up to 6 CPD hours from the comfort of your own home or practice, with presentations from expert speakers who are passionate about their area of expertise. For more information and to register for your free place today, visit mimslearninglive.com/digital. Last week, the NHS Confederation published a report on NHS capital funding and how the health service can make the most of the limited funding that's available for infrastructure. Nick, that report had some quite interesting things to say about GP premises, didn't it?
We know that much of the general practice estate is in a bad way. The latest RCGP polling found that about a third of GPs say their premises are not fit for purpose. And both the college and the BMA say the government needs to spend billions of pounds basically in upgrading GP premises. This report said that what little money is available for capital investment, not just in general practice but in the NHS generally, is often tied up in red tape. And it said that if the government wants to deliver its target, this aim of shifting more care into the community over the coming years, it's going to have to spend a greater share of capital funding on primary care, community care and mental health care. It also makes the argument for more sort of local freedom around capital investment and on routes to encourage private investment, so ways to encourage third-party developers to get involved in funding new GP premises.
The report had some things to say about the problems with service charges that some practices in NHS Property Services premises are experiencing. Can you remind us a bit about what those problems are and what the report said needed to happen to address it?
A proportion of GP practices in England, maybe about a fifth of practices overall, operate from premises that are part of the NHS estate. Their premises are owned by the NHS. Other practices are basically in premises owned by the partners at the practice or that they lease from commercial providers, that sort of thing. But back in about 2016, we reported on the fact that some of these GP practices in NHS-owned premises were being asked to pay huge service charges, in some cases six-figure sums, by the organisation that took over running these premises following Andrew Lansley's 2012 health reforms. And the organisation in question is NHS Property Services. It's a company wholly owned by the government, but which operates at sort of arm's length from the government and manages NHS premises, including the buildings that a lot of GP practices work from. Basically, it was expected to move the relationship with practices in these premises to a more commercial footing. Part of that involved imposing these service charges, which previously health authorities or primary care trusts or whatever hadn't levied from practices. And these charges were so big in some cases, like I said, that they meant practices may not actually be financially viable anymore. So there have been legal disputes. In a recent case backed by the BMA, 5 practices managed to get their service charge debts reduced significantly. But a lot of these charges are still outstanding and have been for a long time. So one of the things this report called for was a one-off settlement to kind of fix this problem, to pay off the debts and then sort of reset. And as part of that, the report suggests scrapping NHS Property Services altogether.
What did the NHS Confederation say should replace NHS Property Services if we got rid of that? Who would look after GP premises?
So the reason for setting up NHS Property Services in the first place was that as part of those Lansley reforms, primary care trusts were scrapped. And at the time, they were the organisations responsible for sort of dealing with these NHS-owned premises. And because the successor organisations were called clinical commissioning groups, CCGs, they were sort of technically run by GPs, and it was seen as a sort of conflict of interest for GP-led organisations to be controlling the premises that GP practices were working from. So there was a decision to sort of split that responsibility up. NHS Property Services was created to sort of carve that out. But now the argument is that with CCGs no longer existing, there's no reason why integrated care boards can't take on that responsibility. So basically, there's an argument that the case for the existence of NHS Property Services isn't there anymore.
And so what did the BMA say about all of this? Does it think it's a good idea?
BMA is all for this. It says it's worked with NHS Property Services to try and sort out some of these issues around the service charges for many, many years, but that problems are continuing and that ultimately having this company as a landlord just isn't working for many GP practices. Part of the problem is that many of the practices in NHS-owned premises didn't have proper lease agreements in place setting out the terms of their occupancy. Basically, they were often working on the basis of old agreements with NHS organisations that have long since ceased to exist. So NHS Property Services arguably inherited a tough situation that it hasn't been able to solve over the past decade. That ultimately comes down to it trying to squeeze money out of practices that they just don't have. So the BMA view now is that it should be scrapped, basically to remove this layer of what it sees as unnecessary bureaucracy, as well as to draw a line under these long-running disputes like the report sort of suggested. NHS Property Services, for its part, argues that getting rid of it after a decade or more of building up expertise running the NHS estate just wouldn't make sense. So we'll see. Wes Streeting has been critical of some other arm's-length organisations, notably the CQC, and there's a review at the moment of the CQC and some other sort of regulatory organisations that's ongoing. So I wonder if NHS Property Services might end up in the firing line too. as the government thinks through how to move forward with its 10-year NHS plan.
That's interesting as well, isn't it? Obviously, estates and infrastructure are going to be so critical to the success of the 10-year plan, and particularly building up capacity and space in primary care and in general practice, to deliver on many of these things that the government seems to want to do. So, there's going to have to be some big picture solution on how to do that if they want to move more care out of hospitals and into the community. And you could see that, NHS Property Services could well get caught up into any plan that they come up with about that. Before we go, we've just got time for our regular good news story, and this week it's about practices across the northwest of England securing new funding to become a research hub. Kimberley, what's all this about?
22 practices won a share of £980,000 to help them develop unused rooms and become a research hub. So each site has received around £49,000 from the National Institute for Health and Care Research, Northwest Regional Research Delivery Network, and the Applied Research Collaboration Northwest Coast Group. The sites can also receive additional funding to increase the working hours of research staff. The hubs have been kitted out with several pieces of equipment, including ultra-low temperature freezers for storing samples and vaccines, vital signs monitors, and ECG machines. Each hub is carrying out different research projects that they chose themselves, and these projects cover areas such as telephone triage, UTI infections, neurovirus, and dermatology. Practices were chosen if they could prove that they had a commitment and eagerness to research and that they would continue the research into the future. But I did speak with Julie Magaza, who is the primary research delivery manager from the organisation that funded the research. She told me that the institute decided to allocate funding to general practice because usually funding for research goes into secondary care, and by making this change it will help with the government's plans to move research out of hospitals and nearer patients in the community. She also said that there are hidden benefits, such as practices having better retention and recruitment rates.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks to Nick and Kimberley. I'll be back next week, so please do join me then. In the meantime, don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest news and access many other resources on our website at GPonline.com.